So, greetings to you all, and Kuyanak for allowing me to be here in your presence. I wanted to thank Ebby Fogratsen and also Gita Riemer for the invitation to come to the university here, and also to my colleague David Brown in the United States Agency for International Development for allowing a message of research that deals with many of the Inughuit elders and hunters here in Greenland, and to bring the value of that back to you as students so you can understand how a researcher, and perhaps many of you have even embarked on some venture where you've combined some kind of local knowledge with a scientific question. But I certainly have done it for a long period of time, and hopefully it can offer some insights and some observations on how to best proceed. Obviously, I'm American, so I come from a very different perspective. Many of you are local, so some of that trust relationship that you build with local communities may be more inherent. I had to work for my trust, most certainly. But it's been a pleasure and a privilege to be in your gracious country and to be amongst the people and to share what I feel is a privilege to have made many friends here, including many of the elders that I have incorporated in the research. So we start with Sedna, the goddess of the ocean here. So because I'm dealing with two topics here at the same time, and then we'll kind of blend them a little bit, I'm dealing with both narwhals and traditional knowledge. And this audience probably will have a different show of hands, but how many people have actually seen narwhals in this audience? Yeah, see, you can't get that in an American crowd, that's for sure. So, yeah, exactly. So I don't have to explain that part of it. But this has been a fascination for me as a dentist because I can tell you on the planet there is no other animal that has such an extraordinary tooth as the narwhal. It literally defies every principle and property of evolution of teeth that I ever learned in school. And it's no wonder, for those of you who know about Charles Darwin and how he kind of neatly categorized everything, he scratched his head. He had sleepless nights over organisms like the narwhal. He really couldn't figure out lion manes or peacock feathers either. So they're all kind of thrown into this category of secondary sexual characteristic, right? Everyone thinks, oh, long tusk, typical male vision, they fight it for the female. Couldn't be probably more untrue of this whale. So I'm going to get you in the water with them a little bit. This is just a short video. Let's see if we can. And then I'll come back, because I think you need to see them swimming.
One other aspect that we look at is obviously the ability of this tusk to act as a sensor organ to detect salinity gradients. In the Arctic, it's important to notice that in the wintertime, when ice is being formed, it extrapolates these freshwater components, leaving a high salinity gradient. And likewise, the Arctic Ocean has lots of gradients within the salt environment for this whale to be able to detect and also to use. Obviously, this isn't the way it works in rehearsal. There's a lot of waves out there, so it's pretty tough to attach to them.
So I've had the pleasure and privilege to work with Sir David Attenborough on one BBC video that you just had seen. It's very difficult for those of you who know about narwhal to film them. This is extraordinary footage, probably the most extraordinary I've ever seen. The BBC spent about 2 months here and had no luck, literally, until the very last day when they were leaving. They had given up everything and actually captured this video on their last day. And that's typical of Arctic research, right? You can go in with your best intentions, best efforts. Nothing happens because naturally animals don't show up when it's convenient for you. They're just going to show up when they want to. And if your camera's not ready and you're not ready, why, they just move on to another location. So this is a graphic representation of the Inuit calendar, 6 seasons, governed by lots of different things, including the migration of animals, ice flow, water, the stars, the seasons, and everything basically on this map is in flux. The Arctic, as most of you know, is changing at 2 to 3 times the rest of the planet, influenced by all sorts of things, from ice sheet melt. We'll talk about, this is one of the graphic representations, so you get an idea of how the polar ice sheet has changed with time, and lots of other variables. I'm going to go through another video while I talk, because it takes a little while, but you can see what is actually happening. This is all done from NASA research. So all sorts of things. Most people talk about ocean acidification, but there are certainly lots of other factors going on at the same time. Of particular interest to me is the leaching of calcium ions. So most people don't talk about this in the common public forums, but there are many organisms that don't, invertebrates, for example, that have shells that are dependent or outer coverings that are dependent on calcium structure and are now being born without those. I deal with vertebrates, so that chain is up the food web. We don't know the impact of that decreased calcium because all the ocean chemistry is changing right now. So there are a lot of changes at work here, and we want to be cognizant of those in the environment because that's the place we're working, and this is the particular time that we are working. I always tell people in biologic questions, we're on a large evolutionary scale, right? I mean, if you look at a planet that's 4.5 billion years old, we're a millisecond of time, our existence here. And what we see and what we observe is just a reflection of that millisecond. It could mean something, it could mean nothing. So when people do these broad diagrams of what's going to happen or what the impact is going to be, sure, that's great for now, but we don't know how we relate to the larger evolutionary picture, and certainly that's true of the work I do. So these are all, and some of you may even recognize, do any of you recognize any of these people? These were done about, who does? Raise your hands, I just want to see how many. Calais, or which one? Yeah, okay. Oh, that's Calais, Mulgard. He's from Disco Island. Yeah. Yeah, this is great. See, don't get that in an American audience either. So this is great. So these are, people who, as you know, are friends, relatives, and in my case, people who contributed a great amount of energy and effort into helping the research advance. Without the voices from these folks, I can't stand here and really make a great presentation. So I stand on their knowledge and certainly carry that with me everywhere I go, including every part of the process. So when we go to publication, for example, I'm probably one of the few investigators that actually includes elders and hunters as authors on an article. That, oddly enough, is against an international treaty which prescribes that people on publications actually physically alter or change or edit some form of the manuscript. And it's a little difficult for these folks because obviously most of it's an oral tradition, right? So it's a little bit difficult to play the rules of a different game, if you will. But they have been invaluable to the work that we do. So, this is the incredible whale and the incredible, extraordinary tooth that has fascinated me that I told you about. It's the only straight tusk on the planet, only spiraled tusk on the planet. It, like I said, has many of the superlatives in nature that we reluctantly as scientists want to say, right? Because in science, any superlative you throw out there, chances are pretty good someone along the line is going to say, oh no, I know something that's actually more than that, So, but with narwhal, you don't have to worry about that. Narwhal is actually characteristic of so many extremes in nature that it is clearly outside the realm of most other animals. And for that reason, especially for the tooth, it became an interest to me as a dentist, because people always wonder, what's a dentist doing up here, talking about narwhal research? And I get this everywhere, right? Because I'm at National Science Foundation meetings and National Geographic and all sorts of venues, and definitely I'm the only dentist there. I can tell you that much. So, but that's the relation. If people need to have a link. And these are the communities that I primarily have worked out of. So I've collected traditional knowledge out of all of these local communities. And typically what I would do is go into a local community and I would ask people, who are the treasured or highly regarded hunters and elders, so I could screen the people that we would talk to, and then typically we would pick, between probably about 4 or 5 from each community. And then I did wave files and also broadcast quality video, which is also archived on a National Science Foundation site called Eloka, E-L-O-K-A, which can be accessed now. So I've worked with the National Science Foundation probably for the last 15 years. I've been a scientist in multiple departments. Oddly enough, because I'm working in traditional knowledge and also polar research, but also working with actually the nervous system of this whale, I'm in 3 departments that hardly even talk to each other, let alone fund one person. So I straddle lots of different departments, and although that might be unusual, it provides a benefit because I represent a bridge. I'm the person that the National Science Foundation had seen back in 2005 when there was a highlight to the US Congress as someone who could communicate equally between people in social science who valued this kind of knowledge and people in science. So I came to your wonderful country. These are all taken in Greenland. We had wonderful photographers with us at all parts of the trip. Umanak, for those of you who recognize. And then and I must say the thing that is most stunning to me as a researcher and just observing the environment in the Arctic, and it's true also in the Canadian high Arctic as well, I'm amazed how the light and the environment changes in a split second. I mean, everything changes. And it's equally remarkable to the people who have adapted to an environment like that, because certainly your preparation and your ability to survive that environment is remarkable. I'm actually in this slide, believe it or not. I wanted to show you some of the campsites that we had. I'm in the picture on the bottom there, but I wanted to give it a sense of dimension so you realize that that's about as big as you are in that environment, right? So you're very humble in your approach to it. When I showed the polar bear on the last slide, I'm going to tell just a quick story about polar bears and the difference between, in Canada, I don't know what they call them here, but we were called Kelowna in Canada, as the kind of the southerners. And it was interesting being around hunters because the first time I was with a hunter out on a campsite, a polar bear had come up and he asked me to be on polar bear watch because there was just 2 of us. So I'm sitting, and I had never been on polar bear watch, had no clue about what to do. Had a little, plastic can sitting on an ice floe edge. This was like May, June. And he said, wake me up if a polar bear comes. And my first question was, how close does the polar bear have to be before I wake you up? And he said, you'll know. So anyway, it's about maybe 3 or 4 in the morning, and sure enough, polar bear just comes right out of the ice floe and right onto the ice. I mean, and it's very hard to estimate distance in the Arctic. I'm something that looks like it's going to be an easy hike, it can take you like a day. You'd think it's like an hour away, right? So you're walking, you're going, oh, okay, I didn't intend for this. But at any rate, the polar bear was a fair distance away from me, let's say a few hundred yards. And I thought, okay, I'll just wait and see what the polar bear is going to do. And so he slowly, kind of wandered around, coming in my direction. And then I thought, oh, maybe I should get up. So I got up, and then the polar bear gets up on his hind legs. And I always tell people, you have no idea how big a polar bear is till you see one in nature on its back two legs, right? I mean, you're just completely dwarfed by this thing. So I thought, okay, this is probably the time I wake up the hunter. So I knock on his, little cabin there, and I say, is that close enough? He goes, yep, that's close enough. So interestingly enough, he didn't do anything. He had his, rifle there, but he said, we're going to wait for the polar bear to figure out its environment. We're not going to do anything. So I just sat and watched the whole process, stayed quiet. And sure enough, the polar bear left. And the hunter said something very interesting to me, and that was that the polar bear is the king of this environment. He said, we let the king decide on his terms what he wants to do. So years later, fast forward, I'm in a camp with primarily scientists and southerners, and we have polar bears coming into our camp. And the instant response is we all have guns, and they fire cracker shells at the polar bear to scare him away, right? And it was at a distance further than the distance I was on in my little plastic, container there. Again, I didn't say anything. I'm just watching the whole process. All through that entire expedition, we had polar bears stalking us. They'd come in at 3 a.m. They'd set up tripwires. The polar bears found the one place where the tripwire was faulty. So polar bears are amazingly smart too. So, but the lesson was that indeed I saw what the hunter was saying, because here were people trying to think that they were going to tell the polar bear, we're occupying this place. And surely enough, the polar bear on its terms decided, I'll decide what that is. And if it needs to be 3 o'clock in the morning and I need to get you out of your tents or whatever, so be it. So anyway, interesting knowledge story. So one of my favorite hunters, Inughuit Kusut there from Kanak, this is a guy that would disappear for months on end in Kanak, and every time he left, people thought he was dead or something happened to him, and then just merrily he would walk into town later. And that smile is not for the picture, by the way. This is the guy's personality. Just one of the most delightful people. And, so I learned a lot of information from them. So this tooth, for example, it's different expressions. In science books, we don't really get any of the depth that these folks have. I mean, it's not even close. So, for example, male and female. Certainly, most males have the tusk. Some males don't. Some females have the tusk. Most don't. Some males have 2 tusks, very rare. Some females have 2 tusks, more rare. And you have every combination. This is completely odd in tooth expression for mammals, just so you know. No other mammal on the planet has that kind of variation for their tooth expression. Nor do they have obvious things like symmetry off as much as a narwhal does. So if you drew a midline down your face, your teeth on your right and left side would be roughly the same size and a mirror image of each other. And maybe for males, might be slightly bigger, who knows. But in narwhal, it couldn't be much different, right? I mean, you've got one side that has this 8 to 9 foot tusk sticking out, and the right side has this 1 to 2 foot tusk embedded in its skull. So it's a completely odd situation. And also for dimorphism, the difference between males and females. For the most part, male and female teeth are really the same across all mammalian species. Narwhal couldn't be more different. So all of these features, again, are the reason why a dentist is standing in front of you. And as I went around collecting this knowledge, we came up with an interesting attribute, which was that this tusk had the ability to bend and flex all over the place. And we thought, I was with at the time the head of the Paffenberger Research Institute. It's now called the Volpe Research Center at the National Institutes of Standards and Technology in Washington, D.C. We kind of shook our heads, because we'd all seen tusks. And for those of you who've seen them, they look really rigid, right? I mean, it looks like you can't bend and flex this thing. So when a hunter tells you, yeah, they can wave this thing, they can, it moves, we're kind of like, really? So interestingly enough, we take samples of this tusk back to a lab. That's the gentleman who was head of the lab. And we do a very fancy technique. I won't bore you with the name because It's long and involved. But basically, you're firing infrared rays at crystalline structures of teeth, and you're trying to find out the relative density. So it turns out from this analysis that indeed the narwhal tusk can bend and flex 12 degrees in every single direction. It astounded us. It is the most flexible, most durable material on the planet, bar none. It has completely odd characteristics. Typically, if something is strong, it lacks flexibility, and likewise, if something is flexible, it's typically not strong. Narwhal has both of these in extreme, so much so that it's likely going to be a valuable substance in some biometric term. You know, right now we're making airplanes out of composite materials. You know, who knows? You could make something out of a, narwhal tusk material. This is something, when you apply what nature has done and what this whale has adapted to, their teeth are almost built the exact opposite of ours. We have enamel on the outside. These guys have no enamel. And our teeth get softer as you go inside till you get a pulp. And these guys are built inside out, so it's like a rod of steel in the center. Everything else around it is flexible. Important message, the hunters were correct. Pavia Nielsen, I funded him on a National Science Foundation grant to represent the Inuit quota situation for narwhal back around 2005. This has always been a debate. I have no interest in getting involved in the debate, but always there has been this association of more whales reported by hunters than quotas that are allotted by scientists, right? It's an ongoing debate, happens all the time. I will tell you one interesting statistic, though. When we did the exhibit at the Smithsonian, I don't know did any of you hear about this or go to that exhibit in Washington, D.C.? I don't know oh, great. So I was the curator of that exhibit, just so yeah. So I curated that exhibit, and when we were starting the formation of it, we had a statistic that was published by, International Whaling, NAMCO. All these folks agreed on a population of about 75 to 80,000. So that was our figure when we were doing the planning stages. Turned out before we went to the actual exhibit, that figure had doubled. So it was about 150,000. And I'm thinking, well, that's a lot to be off, right? I mean, if you're a scientist and you're off by, 100%, that's a pretty big figure to be off. So again, it shows you the inconsistency of what science may be able to offer and the combined knowledge of what hunters can offer. Naturally, they're always in radio communication, and I think part of the debate was that, when they were doing some of these quotas, they do aerial surveys, they fly over, they count whales. The Inuit were the people that had, basically informed that narwhals don't swim on one layer, you can't count the whales on top. They swim in sometimes 4 layers. So one layer takes its turn, comes up, the other layer goes down, then the other layer comes up. So the amount you actually see on the surface is roughly 3 to 4 times what may be below. This guy's a card too. He's like this all the time too, I think. He loved the camera. We have so many photographs of him. We've done series. So this was the evolutionary layout of teeth in whales, in toothed whales. And you can see that one, doesn't fit the picture, right? I mean, this is the thing that made Darwin scratch his head. Also Linnaeus, right? He called it monodon monoceros. So monodon means one tooth. Well, it doesn't have one tooth. It has 2 teeth and arguably 4. And then monoceros, which means horn, doesn't have any horns. These are teeth. Very different concept. It actually confused the literature, because when I did the reading, and still in the public press, oftentimes it's referred to as the narwhal horn. And that's a big error, because horn and teeth are derived from very different embryologic tissues. Horn is, primarily ectoderm, and teeth have all 3 layers. So I argue, and as I did in a paper I did, that this tusk is actually a sensory organ. It's not it's not what you may fabricate as this passive thing that is used to chew and bite your food. So this was also done with the help of traditional knowledge here in Greenland and also in Canada. Obviously, they're cutting open the stomachs. They know exactly what narwhal eat. They know pretty much the diet of most animals that they're working with. And oftentimes they can cut open the stomach of a freshly caught narwhal and have dinner there, because it takes usually a few hours for the whale to digest its food. And you would think with that kind of a diet, you'd have a lot of teeth in your mouth, right? Well, there's the narwhal mouth. Nothing. Zip. You know, you got this big fish, you got nothing to chew it with. And again, it's counterintuitive. There's a whole body of literature that shows how teeth evolve in relationship to their diet. It's almost like a mantra, right? So, again, narwhal doesn't fit. You know, if you're eating those kinds of fish, that's not the mouth you want. And then you have to think, most of the fish it eats swim faster than the narwhal. So, you know, how do they even catch the fish? So a lot of these basic questions, and everyone thinks everything is kind of known about whales, you know, but common things like how do they eat, where do they find these things, these are basic biologic questions that still have to be answered. I honestly think that most of these questions, when they're perused enough with traditional knowledge and science working together, can be answered as a conglomerate. They can work together to get a higher basis of result than either will on their own. So I'm all about complementing both and finding bridges and ways for both of these sides to work more effectively together. This was Rasmus Avike. We were talking with just hunters at KNAPK just yesterday, and I told them about him telling us about narwhal molting, because all the scientists that I had been out in the field with said, you know, narwhal come into these freshwater inlets a lot of times, and we don't know, necessarily what the purpose of that travel is. And most of them say, well, we know it's not because of molting. And interestingly enough, Rasmus was telling a story, because again, I was recording them, and I allowed them to actually speak openly. I had some directed questions, but sometimes I just wanted to hear what they had to say about anything, because you never know what's going to come out, right? So anyway, he's speaking, he said, yeah, narwhal molt. And this is all being done in Greenlandic, so I have to, kind of pay attention to how it's being translated here. And I said, could you tell him to stop and explain what he means? So he said, yeah, I was on a kayak next to a narwhal, and he said, I saw a very thin gauze layer of skin coming off, and then it just dissipated into the water. And I said, wow, that's a whole different way. No wonder nobody's observed it. It's not like a beluga that sheds this huge skin, right? That's very easy to visualize. No wonder no scientist is going to see it. And he's only seen it once. But interestingly enough, of the hunters that we talked to just yesterday here, 2 of them had seen it. So there is consensus among them, because always the question in science is, if you have one person and you say, I know they molt, the scientist's first question is going to be, one guy, one observation, how are we going to go to bat with that? Is that a publication? How's that going to work? And the only retort you have in social science is to say, because their lives depend on it, that's why. This isn't like an observation that hunters are making. This is one of the characteristic differences. This isn't something that they're observing just so they can have background knowledge. This is their lives. This is how they go out and do hunting and make sure they come back in one piece. They know all these things. And so another valuable insight. Jens Rosing did a fabulous book, again, on narwhal and the classification of narwhal. So most of the anatomy that I was utilizing was based on some of the original charts that he had done. We elaborated a little bit more on that. And indeed, a publication that just came out from the Smithsonian on Arctic crashes, if any of you have a bent towards that. I have a chapter in that book where we talked about very in-depth classifications, but most of them done on the basis of what hunters offered. On the science side, what I would do is bring back some of these anatomic specimens. We ran them through CAT scans, and then we did reconstructions. So we have anatomic plates that look not only like that, but more like this as well. So we have characteristic understanding of where some of the embedded teeth, the teeth on the bottom are these kind of supernumerary teeth. These are the narwhal has at birth the potential to form 8 pairs of teeth. So it can form 16 teeth. 6 of them at birth get genetically silenced, which is an interesting add-on to that thing about diet, right? So that whale had the potential to form 12 teeth in its mouth to bite and chew its food, but something in the evolutionary DNA said, no, we don't need that. We'd much rather have no teeth and swallow the fish whole. And then it had these other two teeth that we think are going to, becoming obsolescent, so they're being phased out. But that issue I mentioned about evolutionary timeline is important because you don't know where you are. So when we published the paper, we said, maybe millions of years ago, this whale appeared and all of them had tusks. And maybe now they're being phased out. Maybe that's why you have this odd distribution of male and female. The characteristic has been, it's a secondary sexual characteristic because now it's in males. And, that's kind of a convenient path to go. But again, like I said, nature isn't always convenient. It doesn't always fit into the box that you put it in. And, I was just reading a paper by a guy named Agassiz, who was the founder of the Comparative Museum at Harvard. And after his long study, he said, all these things that we've done to design these convenient categories of how things fit, he said, I'm not so sure. How we relate things to one another and how we organize things, it's all to establish an order and a sense of how the world is organized, but can things come up where it changes? Sure. And I think narwhal is going to be, and certainly is, one of those to be explained. This is another video because I'm going to just show you this quickly because there was a big debate about what tusking was all about, and science had kind of put out a bunch of papers saying this was an aggressive interplay between males, that, they were fighting for the female. And all the elders and hunters that we talked to said, they're not about fighting at all. This is really ritualistic. It has a deeper meaning for these whales and shouldn't be in that kind of category, but I wanted to show some of the video of the tusking because that's kind of rare to see as well.
It's used for fencing, yet these exchanges are too gentle to be real fights. Perhaps these encounters are to remind each animal of where it stands in narwhal society. We may never know.
Well, that's a delightful sound, right? It was interesting. I was once at a music concert, and I remember someone had a child, and it was a baby that was making noise, and everyone thought, it's going to interrupt things, it's going to bother. And the musician on stage loudly proclaimed, "What a beautiful sound!" So it's not an interruption, just so you know. Any rate, when we were talking about the tusking and some of these adaptations, there are a whole set of other biologic questions that certainly need to be told. And when we observed areas around, especially the male tusk, you see these sea lice. Many of you seen these on narwhal? Is this something that... so if they get injured or wounded by, let's say, a killer whale attack, yeah, maybe it's not the most pleasant slide after lunch, huh? Okay. So... But at any rate, this, as the hunters describe, is, I'll get that for you.
Thank you.
Sure. So this is their form of wound healing. So these lice will stay there until that wound is actually healed. On the base of the tusk, you always find these lice because the tissue actually never heals. As a dentist, that was my version of gingivitis or periodontitis, actually. So that's how I saw the whole thing. We also worked with hunters in terms of describing what influence of climate change had on migration. And indeed, it had a pretty interesting one as we developed this map that you see on the right, which looked at the time periods when the whales were there and also the migration pattern. So it changed. During the migration coming down, they would go in Disco Bay, but going up, before they went into Disco Bay, now they went just straight up. Also, there was a lag time of roughly 2 weeks earlier that they would migrate up, and 2 weeks later when they would come back down. And interestingly enough, there was a science publication that came out a few years after this that was almost the identical. So again, shows you the similarity and the reason why this collaboration with science and traditional knowledge is important. Also, a savacid, a sudden freeze of ice, which causes entrapments. There's been a lot more entrapments noted, especially in the past, I would say 10 years, although nobody really had monitored these to a high degree, so nobody knows that actual incidence, but it's pretty well understood that a lot of these entrapments happen because of some of these sudden weather changes. So even though these whales have a means to get from one breathing hole to another, they can hold their breath for about 30 minutes, but if there's fast ice over a long period of time, there can be entrapments. The last one I had roughly about 800 animals outside of Pond Inlet, so it can involve quite a few animals as well. Very few of these elders and hunters have written notes, but when they do, it's extremely valuable to me and to other workers who are working in traditional knowledge, because this is your library. Otherwise, you're recording people, you're asking them to draw figures. It can be a little bit more cumbersome. In this case, we worked with 2 elders and hunters who already had notebooks. Again, it took a lot of trust to get access to these books. We're working on a publication now that's going to document just one of the elders' notebooks because I think it's an invaluable source. And honestly, my effort, as much as I love science, I think a bright light should be shown on this traditional knowledge. It's enormously important for the progress of science and the understanding of the natural world. These are some of the original sustainable thinkers, right? These are the people that understand how the environment needs to get nurtured, not resource management taking away from the earth, but finding out a way that you are in balance with the earth. These are the lessons that can be heard. So as we go through some of these debates of sustainability, eco-knowledge, the way that climate change influences our planet, these are voices I think that are important to be heard in that arena. This is kind of the general distribution for narwhal, although most of them are primarily in that Davis Day, Baffin Bay between Greenland and the Canada side, and most of the high concentration of the whales is on the Baffin side. So when I'm doing the work in the water that I'll show a little bit later, that's primarily where the work is occurring. This is some of the underwater photography. Again, it's pretty rare to get good shots of narwhal and understand exactly some of their behavioral patterns, which is why, again, the traditional knowledge is important. So from a hunter's perspective, they know that the larger males are always leading the larger groups. And so the question always arises, well, sometimes you see a female first, so what's that all about? And some of the elders describe that narwhal actually have almost a slave culture. You know, it's like in our country, in the U.S., we have white-tailed deer, and it's very typical for the males, when they think there's hunting season, to nudge like a younger female and say, you go out. You know, they want them to be the test. And the hunters say the same thing for the narwhal, that, you know, if they think it's risky going up after they've migrated for a long time, they send up someone else, you know, say, you be the test, you know, and then we'll come up. And if you see it on the other side, for the hunters, the really smart hunters wait. They're very patient, because usually the first whales that pop up are not the ones they're really interested in. They want to wait for the larger guys with the bigger tusks, and those are the careful ones. They also describe a culture of scouts, younger males who are on the outside perimeter of the migrating group. And the scouts are the way to directionalize any kind of impact that may come from the group from the sides. This is all great behavioral information. You could spend 10 years as a scientist up there and not get this stuff. But again, you have to have enough people that are saying it to document really how this applies in the science literature. These were done by photographer Glenn Williams, who used to work for Fisheries and Oceans in Canada. That was the last 2. I always show this picture for scientists to say, this is my lab. You know, so when they show me we're doing like very sophisticated experiments out on the ice. But when they show me all their instruments and all their materials, I always show them this and say, okay, here's my lab, so you get an idea of what I'm working in. You saw the video in the beginning where, I have, basically 36-degree water splashing over my head the whole time. And you can't really function with your fingers, in any kind of glove that I've ever worn effectively. So that gets old fast as well. Certainly we're working in dry suits, so that becomes easier an environment to work in, but still one that has some restrictions to it. And this is some of the later work dealing with some of the issues I was working on form and function of the tusk, because no one had really figured out what the form and the function of this was. So I was looking at heart rate and brain activity in relationship to an introduction of salt. So I put high salt concentrations and fresh water alternating in different time periods so it wouldn't influence the experiment at all. And then we would monitor those physiologic signs, and sure enough, the whale does sense differences in salt. It understands these. It interprets them, and it's sensory. Our teeth are the same way, by the way. All mammalian teeth are sensory. Any of you who've gone to the dentist recently know they're sensory, right? If you've had a toothache or a tooth cavity, certainly we have what's called C fibers, which are pain fibers. But we also have A fibers, asensory fibers, as do these guys. So they can sense actually other things. And it's interesting when I give talks. I gave one to an archaeology group, and they said, I found that comment fascinating because they said, my mother was an archaeologist, and she could tell the difference between a stone and a shard by biting on it. She knew for sure which one it was. So we have these kind of capabilities. It's just that on the evolutionary path that we took, we went a very different direction. Narwhals went a completely different one. So this is more of the experimental phase. I had a tusk gasket around. That's how we got the introduction of the salt solutions. And then you see on the other side some of these electrodes, which were on the surface, to be able to get information, physiologic signs, so we understood the relationship of when the stimulus was introduced and what the signs that we saw were. And then we formed some of this work by, this is at SeaWorld in San Diego. I was working with beluga because that's the closest relative to the narwhal. And I was looking at light activity and could these whales perceive and could I read the physiologic signs for them when they interpreted the light that was shining on them. And we did get positive enough results that that's how I designed the experiment. I don't know if you've ever seen the inside of a tusk, but that top slide shows the nerve that's actually inside the tusk. And if you don't see that, you'd be hard-pressed to believe that that thing was actually inside the tusk. Further evidence of the fact that this is sensory. So this whale has gone out of its way to sense its environment for whatever reason. And added evidence that in terms of breaking its tusk, so for example, all these people that said, they were fighting or all these tusks are broken, the last thing this whale wants to do is break its tusk. Last thing. And in fact, if it does break it, unlike other mammalian species like elephant, for example, or walrus, they have no reparative function. So once it's broken, you're out of luck. So that was that work. And then we found these tubules were open and patent all the way through. Did analysis of the heart rate for salt and fresh water. Huge difference between what they could perceive. This is the heart rate of a narwhal, which I was very happy to be the first one to put on a slide. So I'm always happy to be associated with the heart of any animal. So anyway, that's the narwhal heartbeat. And this was the cover of the Anatomical Record, which is an evolutionary journal. We were the cover story for this particular issue. This was back in 2014. We had multiple ways of defining this too, because once you build a structure in science, it's very hard for the next person that comes along that finds a very different pathway, because automatically you're going to get critique all over the place. We already knew that ahead of time, so I found 5 pathways to get to the same result. I always tell people truth is like a globe with a dot inside, right? I mean, the dot is kind of truth. And you find multiple pathways to get there. And you can do it a lot of different ways. You don't have to go one way. And certainly when you learn, as is the point of, I think, an educational model, which I want to bring to a larger group of younger people, including like high school and even grade school, is to understand that we're only taught usually one way to think, and there are multiple ways of thinking. And certainly the Inuit and Inughuit elders that I talk to have a very different perception and way of thinking than I would. Seals can do the same thing, sensory. Everyone thought these whiskers were just plain, but those little spherules on their whiskers are motion detectors. Walrus, same way. Everyone thought that they broke their tusks, that they broke mollusks with their tusks, but then had these kind of suckers that could get the meat right out of the shell. So very different ways of seeing the world and how animals adapt to it. So how many of you are familiar with the Inuit legend of the Narwhal? Is that a common thing too, or is that something? We got one, half of one. So the Inuit legend of the Narwhal has been an interesting story, but it's the Inuit way to describe how the narwhal came to be. And interestingly enough, another one of the ways that they differ in terms of knowledge is that this kind of mystery, if you will, or legend, is real for them. They don't delineate, to my knowledge, between what they really observe and some of these legends. There's a real sense of what these mean to them, what they are, and how they get integrated. And it's interesting because I won't tell you the story, you can read it on your own, but basically it's kind of a golden rule in Christianity, but with a little bit of a twist. And the twist is that a blind son, at the end of being treated very badly by his mother, takes revenge by harpooning a beluga, which you see here, and the hair of the mother becomes twisted into the tusk. And to this day, if they see a narwhal swimming with a group of belugas, it's legend that that's the woman. So when we try to reach people with this knowledge, we do it in several ways. This was a book that I co-authored with a guy named Bill Fitzhugh, who is the director of the Arctic Studies Center at the Smithsonian, and was also the co-curator for the exhibit that we did with the same title. This book won the William Mills Prize for polar books in the last 2 years, so it was the top selection. We had a composite of people, but essential in designing the authors were bringing elders and hunters to the same platform. So people can see a demonstrable evidence of how they should be seen in relationship to science. Not as a footnote, not as a by the way, but as a full collaborator in a full book and being recognized with exactly the knowledge that they had to offer. Lots of other ways to reach people. This is a graphic novel that my wife and I are working on. She's Eco Hero. She's an environmental economist working in the sustainable sector. I'm obviously Dr. Narwhal there. And it goes through a tale with lots of different characters, including an Inughuit elder and his daughter, his granddaughter, and a hedgehog who is the inspirational Buddha there on the lower right. And reaching people in different ways, and this is the Inuit legend that's incorporated into the tale. And the whole idea is that you really shouldn't have to wait till you get a PhD to get introduced to traditional knowledge. And that's typical of our education in the US, and it's typical in Europe as well. It's not often that you get these introductory components at a point in your childhood where it shapes you. It shapes how you think, how you perceive the world. And I always tell people, you learn history when you get out of school. That's when someone finally gets you the truth, right? Because there's something in there and they go, that's not what I heard, you know. And they always say, you know, the traditional lesson is history is told by the victors, right? So the people that lose never get to really participate in that story very often. Another way to reach people is with this technology called Microsoft HoloLens. Any of you familiar with this at all? Any hands? Yeah, you are. Great. So this is augmented reality. Does that mean more to people? Is that still we got the guy, right? All right. So most of you probably were introduced to virtual reality. Probably more hands there, right? Where it closes off. There's an exhibit now at the Cultural Center that has virtual reality. So augmented reality, we can be talking to each other, and instead of me having slides, I can have holograms floating around this audience. So if I'm explaining a narwhal tusk, I can literally have this thing swim out to you, and it can show you the tusk while I'm speaking. I don't need a slide. And indeed, as a future, in the same way that we've gone from a telephone to a television to a computer to a laptop to a PDA, we will all eventually be wearing glasses. We will not be carrying around our computer. We will not be seeing a secondary sense of where we are. It has isolated us in a way. It has, interestingly enough, made us more lonely, even though we have 1,000 Facebook friends. We're in a place, we're not really interacting. And the advantage of augmented reality is we can be on the street, we could be talking, and you could say, if we were wearing the Hololens, you could say, oh, you should try this cafe. And I said, I don't know where it is. And you put out the cafe right in front of me in a hologram. You say, it's right here. You know, you recognize this location, just walk down there. When you see that, go to the cafe. This technology is already out, by the way. This is not like Dreamland or something in the future. It's already going on right now. And I worked with it when I saw it. These are some of the holograms. So this is actually an experience. I already have this now. I've worked on this for the last 2 years from a grant from the National Science Foundation. This globe could be in the middle of us speaking. So when I'm talking about narwhal migration, I can show you narwhal migration in a three-dimensional model that you can all see. These whales would be swimming, by the way, so you can see kind of as they're swimming in their environment where they are. And we can do questions about them. And if you had HoloLens, you could say, oh, well, I had a different model. I thought this one was important. And you could show up your little hologram, and we could have an interactive thing. This is going on, by the way, at the university I worked out of, Case Western Reserve University. The medical school, which all had cadavers to dissect, now everybody is using holograms. That's how they dissect a body. Even when they're training for surgeries on a very advanced degree, these are doctorates doing this, they're using holograms. It's a much easier way, and it has the benefit of giving you a three-dimensional concept of what you're learning, what you're studying, because the hardest thing to teach, really in science particularly, but in lots of fields, is the three-dimensionality of something. So I'm going to show you some of the images. These are all from the program that I've already done. This is Narwhal hologram, and I'll show you the experience as people see it. But these are, you know, you're in the experience now, but like I said, if you were in it visually, you'd be seeing all these things moving and interacting to tell the story. So these were isolated from the experience, and then I'm going to show you people actually in the experience that I was able to take a picture of. So now here's people in the experience, so you get to see an idea of what they're experiencing. So these have narwhals coming at them. And I have to tell you, it's entertaining to watch people in the experience, because the entire time their mouth is like, oh my God, whoa. And if you're seeing it from the outside, you don't see the hologram, so you have no idea what they're reacting to. They look like they're, you know, going a little crazy there, but this is kind of what it is. So you can see them both smiling. You know, this was a whale that came up to them and their mouth opened up. And again, they can see the whale. They could be talking to each other during the experience, unlike virtual reality, which walls you off. So this is a shared experience. And this was a game we devised at the end where everybody became a narwhal. So I don't know if any of you had read or heard about this phenomenon that happened out of Canada, but there were people that had visualized and seen narwhals supposedly stunning fish. So the publication hasn't come out yet, but we devised a fun game so that when you became the narwhal, if you came a certain distance to a fish, you could stun it. We chose the right prey, Arctic cod, Greenland halibut. So there's fish swimming around you, and when you stun one, you get a scoreboard. And at the end of the game, a bunch of confetti flies, virtual confetti flies all around the room. So, you know, the winner's declared and you have fun. And I just want to end with this slide, which I always do, because it's side by side with a hunter. And I think this is the future of science. I think it's side by side collaboration in every single way that we can work. And I just want to thank you all for sitting attentively. And I've seen most people smile, so that's good. I haven't seen anyone sleep yet, so that's even better. So thank you very much.